In the autumn of 1890, a young man stood on a hillside overlooking the Allegheny River in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, envisioning something extraordinary. Henry John Heinz had already revolutionized American food production with his bottled horseradish and ketchup, but now he wanted something more permanent, a legacy carved in stone and mortar that would stand as testament to an immigrant family's rise to unprecedented wealth and influence. What he would create on that hillside would become one of America's most remarkable family estates, a place where industrial fortune met Gilded Age excess, where business empires were planned over elaborate dinners, and where the very definition of American success would be written in architectural splendor. Before we journey deeper into this incredible true story, welcome to the Dark Estate, where we uncover the forgotten histories of America's greatest mansions and the families who built them. If you're fascinated by real historical mysteries and the untold stories of architectural grandeur, please subscribe to our channel, hit that like button, and leave a comment telling us which historic estate you'd like us to explore next. Your support helps us continue bringing these meticulously researched stories to light. Now, let's return to the extraordinary tale of the Heinz family and their magnificent estate. The story of the Heinz estate cannot be told without understanding the man who built it. Henry John Heinz was born on October 11, 1844, in Pittsburgh's Birmingham neighborhood, the son of German immigrants John Henry Heinz and Anna Margaretha Schmidt. His father had arrived in America in 1840 from Bavaria, settling in the rapidly industrializing city that would become the heart of American steel production. Young Henry grew up in a brick house on the south side of Pittsburgh, where his mother cultivated a small garden behind their home. It was here, among the vegetable patches and herb beds, that Henry first learned the value of fresh produce and the possibilities it presented. By the age of 8, Henry was already demonstrating the entrepreneurial spirit that would define his life. He began helping his mother tend their enlarged garden, and soon he was selling surplus vegetables door to door using a basket and later a wheelbarrow. At 12 years old, he was cultivating 3 gardens and employing several workers to help him. By 16, he was using a horse and cart to deliver his produce to Pittsburgh grocers. This wasn't merely child's play. Henry was learning the fundamentals of business, distribution, and quality control that would serve him throughout his life. In 1869, at the age of 25, Henry partnered with L. Clarence Noble to form Heinz and Noble. They began producing and selling horseradish in clear glass bottles, a revolutionary choice at the time when most horseradish was sold in green glass that concealed inferior quality or adulterants. This commitment to transparency and purity would become a hallmark of the Heinz brand. The business initially prospered, but the Panic of 1873, a severe economic depression that gripped the United States, led to the company's bankruptcy in 1875. It was a devastating blow to the young entrepreneur, but Henry John Heinz was not a man to be defeated by a single failure. Within months of the bankruptcy, Henry founded F&J Heinz Company with his brother John and cousin Frederick. This time, he expanded the product line to include ketchup, which he introduced in 1876. The timing was fortuitous. America was entering what would later be called the Gilded Age, a period of rapid economic growth and increasing urbanization. As more Americans moved to cities and worked in factories, there was growing demand for convenient, shelf-stable food products. Heinz positioned his company to meet this demand, always emphasizing quality and purity at a time when food adulteration was rampant and largely unregulated. The company grew rapidly throughout the 1880s. Henry proved to be not just a capable businessman, but also a marketing genius. In 1893, he attended the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, where he gave away free samples of his products and distributed thousands of small pickle-shaped pins. This promotional strategy proved enormously successful, and the pickle pin became one of America's first promotional items. The company's famous 57 varieties slogan was also introduced around this time, in 1896, though by then the company actually produced more than 60 different products. Henry simply liked the sound of the number 57. By the early 1890s, Henry John Heinz was one of Pittsburgh's wealthiest and most prominent citizens. He had married Sarah Sloane Young in 1869, and together they had 5 children: Irene, Clarence, Howard, Robert, and Clifford. As his fortune grew, Henry began planning a residence worthy of his status. He had already built a substantial home in the Allegheny City neighborhood of Pittsburgh, but now he wanted something more: a country estate where his family could escape the smoke and industrial grid of the city, where he could entertain business associates and political figures, and where he could indulge his growing passion for architecture and horticulture. The site Henry chose was in the borough of Sharpsburg, approximately 7 miles northeast of downtown Pittsburgh, on the eastern bank of the Allegheny River. The property offered commanding views of the river valley, and was far enough from the city's industrial core to enjoy cleaner air and a more pastoral setting. The land itself had a rich history. It had been part of the original grants made to Pennsylvania settlers in the 18th century and had been farmland for generations. Henry began acquiring parcels in this area in the late 1880s, eventually assembling approximately 15 acres for his estate. For the design of his mansion, Henry turned to the architectural firm of Alden and Harlow, a prominent Pittsburgh practice known for their work in the Richardsonian Romanesque and Queen Anne styles that were popular among wealthy Americans during the Gilded Age. The lead architect for the project was Frederick John Osterling, who would later become one of Pittsburgh's most renowned architects, designing numerous important buildings throughout the city. Osterling and Henry worked closely on the design, with Henry taking an active role in every aspect of the planning. Construction began in 1890, and the mansion that emerged was truly spectacular. Built of red pressed brick with brownstone trim, the house stood 3.5 stories tall and featured 25 rooms spread across approximately 15,000 square feet of living space. The architectural style was eclectic, drawing primarily from the Richardsonian Romanesque tradition with its heavy stone arches and rough-hewn textures, but also incorporating elements of Queen Anne stick-style architecture in its irregular roofline, multiple gables, and decorative woodwork. The exterior of the mansion was imposing and asymmetrical, as was typical of high-style American architecture in this period. A massive stone archway marked the main entrance, leading into a vestibule floored with Italian marble. The walls were constructed with exceptional solidity. Some were up to 2 feet thick, not merely for structural purposes, but also to provide thermal insulation and a sense of permanence and security. The roof was a complex composition of intersecting gables and hips, covered in dark slate tiles imported from Vermont, punctuated by multiple chimneys serving the house's numerous fireplaces. But it was the interior of the mansion where Henry's wealth and taste were most evident. The entrance hall was dominated by a magnificent grand staircase constructed of solid oak, with elaborately turned balusters and newel posts topped with carved finials. The woodwork throughout the house was exceptional. Walnut, mahogany, cherry, and oak were used extensively, not as veneers but as solid timber, hand-carved by skilled craftsmen. The ceiling in the main hall rose to 18 feet and featured decorative plasterwork with botanical motifs, reflecting Henry's love of horticulture. The drawing room, or parlor, was perhaps the most elaborately decorated space in the house. The walls were covered in silk damask wallpaper in deep burgundy, hung over horsehair reinforced plaster to prevent sagging. The ceiling featured a large plaster medallion at its center, from which hung a massive crystal chandelier imported from France. The chandelier alone was said to have cost more than most Pittsburgh workers earned in a year. The fireplace in this room was surrounded by a carved marble mantelpiece imported from Italy, with intricate scrollwork and floral designs that demonstrated the highest level of stone carving artistry. The dining room was designed to accommodate large formal dinners, with space for a table that could seat 24 guests. The walls were paneled in dark mahogany to chair rail height, with embossed leather wall coverings above. A built-in sideboard occupied one entire wall, its surface of marble for serving cold dishes, its cabinets designed to hold the family's extensive collection of china, crystal, and silver. The room featured its own fireplace with a carved oak mantel depicting a hunting scene, and the windows looked out onto the estate's gardens, providing pleasant views during daytime meals. Henry's personal study was located on the first floor, positioned to give him views of both the river and the main approach to the house. This room was his private domain, where he conducted business correspondence and planned the expansion of his company. The walls were lined with built-in bookcases made of cherry wood, holding Henry's extensive collection of books on horticulture, business, and travel. His desk was a massive piece of furniture, custom-made from walnut, with multiple drawers and compartments for organizing his papers. A fireplace with a simple but elegant marble surround provided warmth during Pittsburgh's cold winters. The second floor of the mansion contained the family's private quarters. The master bedroom suite included a large bedroom, a sitting room, and two separate dressing rooms, one for Henry and one for his wife Sarah. These rooms were more restrained in their decoration than the public spaces downstairs, but no less carefully crafted. The bedroom featured built-in wardrobes with cedar lining to protect clothing from moths, and the sitting room had a bay window with a cushioned window seat where Sarah could enjoy afternoon light while reading or doing needlework. Each of the children had their own bedroom, sized according to their age and status within the family. The rooms were well proportioned and featured built-in closets, still a relative luxury in the 1890s when freestanding wardrobes were more common. The children's rooms were connected by a shared bathroom, one of several in the house. The inclusion of multiple bathrooms with modern plumbing was itself a significant luxury at this time. Each bathroom featured porcelain fixtures, with bathtubs that had both hot and cold running water, supplied by a sophisticated system of pipes, and a dedicated boiler in the basement. The third floor contained additional bedrooms for older children and guests, as well as rooms for the household staff. Even these more utilitarian spaces were well appointed, with plastered walls, wooden floors, and adequate heating. The Heinz family employed a substantial household staff, including a butler, cook, housemaids, laundry maids, and a full-time gardener. Many of these servants lived in the house, and Henry was known as a relatively benevolent employer who paid fair wages and provided good working conditions by the standards of his time. The mansion's basement was divided into several functional areas. A large kitchen occupied the portion beneath the dining room, equipped with the latest cooking technology of the period, including a massive coal-fired range with multiple ovens, warming drawers, and a built-in water heater. Adjacent to the kitchen was a scullery for washing dishes and pots, a pantry for food storage, and a wine cellar where Henry kept an extensive collection of wines and spirits. The basement also housed the mechanical systems that made the house function. The furnace that heated the entire building through a system of registers and radiators, the water tanks and pumps, and the gas generators that provided fuel for lighting before the house was eventually converted to electricity in the early 1900s. But the mansion itself was only part of Henry's grand vision for the estate. The grounds were designed and landscaped with the same attention to detail and expense as the house. Henry employed Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., son of the famous landscape architect who designed New York's Central Park, to help plan the estate's gardens and grounds. The younger Olmsted was building his own reputation as a landscape architect, and the Heinz estate gave him an opportunity to demonstrate his skills. The immediate grounds around the mansion were laid out in a formal style, with geometric beds of ornamental plantings, crushed stone pathways, and carefully pruned specimen trees. A circular drive approached the main entrance, its center planted with a large flower bed that was replanted seasonally to maintain color throughout the growing season. Foundation plantings of rhododendrons and azaleas provided year-round structure, and spectacular blooms in spring. Beyond the formal gardens near the house, the landscape became more naturalistic, though no less carefully planned. Curving paths wandered through groves of oak, maple, and beech trees, some of them existing mature trees that had been preserved during construction, others newly planted specimens chosen for their beauty and eventual size. A stream ran through the lower portion of the property, and Olmsted designed a series of stone bridges to cross it, creating picturesque views that wouldn't have been out of place in an English country estate. Henry's particular passion was for greenhouse cultivation, and he built an extensive greenhouse complex on the estate grounds. This wasn't a small hobby greenhouse but rather a serious horticultural facility, consisting of multiple connected structures, totaling over 5,000 square feet. The greenhouses were constructed with iron frames and thousands of panes of glass, heated by a sophisticated system of pipes carrying steam from a dedicated boiler house. In these greenhouses, Henry grew exotic orchids, palms, tropical fruits, and vegetables year-round. He employed a full-time professional gardener, who had trained in England, to manage the greenhouses and the estate's other plantings. The greenhouse complex was Henry's pride and joy, a place where he could indulge his lifelong love of horticulture that had begun in his mother's vegetable garden. He was particularly proud of his orchid collection, which grew to include hundreds of specimens representing dozens of species. He would often give orchids as gifts to business associates and friends, and he took great pleasure in showing visitors through his greenhouses, explaining the origin and cultivation requirements of various plants. This wasn't merely hobby gardening. Henry approached horticulture with the same systematic, quality-focused mindset he brought to his business, keeping detailed records of plantings, bloom times, and growing conditions. The estate also included several outbuildings beyond the greenhouse complex. A carriage house and stable accommodated the family's horses and vehicles. At its peak, the estate maintained 6 horses and several carriages. The carriage house was itself an impressive structure, built in a complementary architectural style to the main house, with quarters above for the coachman and stable hands. There was also a gardener's cottage where the head gardener lived with his family, a potting shed, a workshop for estate maintenance, and a building that housed the steam plant for the greenhouses. The construction and establishment of the estate cost Henry John Heinz a substantial fortune. Contemporary sources suggest the total expenditure was well over $200,000, equivalent to perhaps $6 or $7 million in modern purchasing power. But for Henry, this wasn't merely an extravagant expense. The estate served multiple purposes in his life and business strategy. It was certainly a family home, a place where his children could grow up in healthy surroundings away from Pittsburgh's industrial pollution. But it was also a statement of arrival, proof that an immigrant's son could achieve the highest levels of American success. More practically, the estate served as an invaluable business tool. Henry regularly entertained business associates, potential investors, retailers, and even competitors at the estate. The impressive setting helped establish his credibility and success, while the comfortable and beautiful surroundings created a relaxed atmosphere conducive to business discussions. Many important deals and strategic decisions were made during dinners in that mahogany-paneled dining room or during tours of the greenhouse complex. The estate was, in a sense, an extension of the Heinz Company's marketing strategy. It conveyed quality, permanence, success, and good taste, all values that Henry wanted associated with his products. The Heinz family moved into their completed estate in 1892, and it quickly became a center of their lives. Sarah Heinz managed the household with the help of her staff, overseeing elaborate dinners and social events. The children grew up exploring the grounds, learning to ride horses, and helping their father in the greenhouses. Henry himself would rise early each morning, often spending an hour in his greenhouses before breakfast, then taking a carriage into the city to his factory and offices. He would return home in the evening, often bringing business associates for dinner. The 1890s were a period of tremendous growth for the H.J. Heinz Company, as it was now called. The company built an enormous factory complex in Pittsburgh's Strip District, along the Allegheny River, where it employed thousands of workers. Henry was known as a progressive employer, who provided better working conditions than most industrialists of his era. The factory included employee lunchrooms, rest areas, and even a rooftop garden where workers could spend their break times. This wasn't entirely altruistic. Henry believed that well-treated workers were more productive and loyal, but it was still unusual for the time and earned him considerable goodwill. Henry was also deeply involved in civic affairs. He served on the boards of numerous Pittsburgh institutions and was active in the local Presbyterian church. He became increasingly interested in Sunday school education and eventually became superintendent of a large Sunday school program in Pittsburgh, personally teaching a men's Bible class for many years. He funded the construction of several churches and Sunday school buildings and was known for his philanthropy, though he preferred to give quietly rather than seeking public recognition. The years around the turn of the century marked the peak of the estate's role as a family home and social center. The Heinz children were growing up, and the house was frequently filled with their friends, with parties and celebrations, with music and laughter. Henry and Sarah celebrated their silver wedding anniversary in 1894 with an elaborate party at the estate, attended by over 200 guests. The event was covered in Pittsburgh newspapers, with detailed descriptions of the decorations, the menu, and the prominent citizens in attendance. But shadows were gathering even during these prosperous years. Sarah Heinz's health had never been robust, and by the early 1900s, she was increasingly unwell. The exact nature of her illness is not entirely clear from historical records. Medical privacy was more respected in that era, but she appears to have suffered from some form of chronic condition that gradually weakened her. She spent more and more time confined to her rooms at the estate, though she continued to manage the household as much as her strength allowed. In March of 1903, Sarah Sloane Young Heinz died at the estate at the age of 53. Her death was a devastating blow to Henry, who had been married to her for 34 years. She was buried in Pittsburgh's Homewood Cemetery, in a plot that Henry had previously purchased for the family. The funeral was a major event in Pittsburgh society, attended by hundreds of people. Henry, who had always been a man of strong religious faith, found solace in his beliefs and in his work, but those close to him noted that he was never quite the same after Sarah's death. Henry never remarried. He continued to live at the estate, but the house became a quieter place. The children were grown or nearly so. Irene had married, and the boys were being prepared to enter the family business. Henry threw himself into his work with even greater intensity. The H.J. Heinz Company continued to expand, opening branches and factories in other cities, and eventually in other countries. Henry traveled extensively, both for business and to visit Heinz facilities around the world. But he always returned to the estate, to his greenhouses and his gardens, which remained his greatest source of personal peace. In 1905, Henry made a significant change to the estate by adding a private chapel. This was a substantial addition to the mansion, built onto one side in a complementary architectural style. The chapel featured stained glass windows, oak pews that could seat about 30 people, and a small pipe organ. Henry had the chapel consecrated and used it for family prayers and private religious services. This addition reflected his deepening religious commitment in the years after Sarah's death, and provided him with a space for personal reflection and worship. The first decade of the 1900s saw Henry John Heinz at the height of his influence and power. The H.J. Heinz Company was now one of America's largest food producers, with facilities throughout the United States and abroad. The company's products were household names, recognizable from coast to coast. Henry was repeatedly approached about selling the company to larger competitors or taking it public, but he always refused. He wanted the Heinz Company to remain family-controlled, a legacy for his children and grandchildren. Henry's sons were now taking active roles in the business. Howard Heinz, the eldest son, was being groomed to eventually succeed his father as head of the company. Clarence, the second son, was also involved in company management, though he never achieved the prominence of Howard. The younger boys, Robert and Clifford, were still completing their educations, but were expected to join the company in due course. Henry was pleased to see his sons continuing his work and began to think seriously about succession and the long-term future of both the company and the estate. The estate itself required constant maintenance and updating. As technology advanced, Henry invested in modernizing the property. Electric lighting was installed throughout the house in the early 1900s, replacing the gas lights that had originally illuminated the rooms. A telephone was installed, connecting the estate to Pittsburgh's growing phone network. The grounds required continuous work. Trees needed pruning, gardens needed replanting, pathways needed maintenance. Henry never stinted on these expenses, maintaining the property to the highest standards. The 1910s brought new challenges. The sinking of the Titanic in April of 1912 shocked American society and reminded everyone of the fragility of human existence, no matter how modern or luxurious the circumstances. World War I began in Europe in 1914, and though America remained neutral for several years, the war disrupted international trade and created uncertainty about the future. The Heinz Company was affected by these global events, but its domestic focus meant that it weathered the disruptions better than many businesses. Henry himself was aging. Born in 1844, he was now in his 70s, and while he remained active and involved in the business, he was no longer the vigorous young man who had built the company and the estate. He suffered from various age-related ailments and was increasingly reliant on his sons to manage day-to-day operations. Yet he still went to the office regularly, and still spent time in his beloved greenhouses, tending his plants and finding peace among the growing things. On May 14, 1919, Henry John Heinz died at the age of 74. He passed away not at the estate but at his city residence in Pittsburgh, surrounded by family members. The cause of death was listed as pneumonia, though at his age, multiple factors likely contributed to his decline. His death was front-page news in Pittsburgh and received national attention. He was widely mourned not just as a successful businessman, but as a philanthropist and progressive employer who had demonstrated that making money and treating people decently were not incompatible goals. Henry John Heinz was buried next to his wife Sarah in Homewood Cemetery. His funeral was one of the largest Pittsburgh had ever seen, with thousands of people attending, including workers from the Heinz factories, business leaders, political figures, and representatives of the many charitable and religious organizations he had supported. The procession to the cemetery was over a mile long. In his will, Henry left the bulk of his fortune to his children, with substantial bequests to various charitable causes. He also left detailed instructions about the continuation of the family business under his son's leadership. Howard Heinz, Henry's eldest son, assumed control of the H.J. Heinz Company. Howard had been born in 1877 and had spent his entire adult life working in the family business, learning every aspect of the company's operations from his father. He had the advantage of inheriting a well-established, profitable company with strong brand recognition and efficient operations. But he also faced the challenge of maintaining and building upon his father's legacy, while adapting to a rapidly changing world. The estate passed to Howard as part of his inheritance, along with his father's share of the company. Howard, who had married and had children of his own, made the estate his family home, just as his father had done. He maintained the property much as Henry had left it, preserving the gardens, the greenhouses, and the mansion itself. Howard shared his father's love of horticulture, though perhaps not to the same degree, and he ensured that the greenhouse complex continued to be maintained and used. The 1920s were years of dramatic change in American society. The country emerged from World War I as a major world power. Prohibition transformed American social life, though it had little direct impact on the Heinz Company, which did not produce alcoholic beverages. The economy boomed, at least for those who participated in the stock market and industrial expansion. Women gained the right to vote. Radio broadcasting began, creating new opportunities for advertising. Automobiles became increasingly common, changing patterns of transportation and residence. The Heinz Company prospered during the 1920s. Howard proved to be a capable, if less charismatic leader than his father. He continued Henry's emphasis on quality and purity, and expanded the company's product line and distribution network. The company's advertising became more sophisticated and widespread, taking advantage of new media like radio. The famous pickle pins gave way to more modern promotional strategies, but the core message remained the same. Heinz products were pure, wholesome, and reliable. The estate during this period remained much as it had been, a substantial family home in the Sharpsburg area of Greater Pittsburgh. The neighborhood around it had changed somewhat. More houses had been built, and the area was less rural than it had been in the 1890s. But the estate's substantial size and careful landscaping still provided a sense of privacy and separation from the surrounding development. The family continued to employ a full household staff, and the property remained meticulously maintained. Then came October 1929, and the stock market crash that began the Great Depression. The effects on the American economy were catastrophic. Banks failed, businesses closed, unemployment soared, and millions of people faced genuine hardship. The Heinz Company, like all businesses, was affected by the Depression. Sales declined as consumers had less money to spend. But the company's focus on affordable, shelf-stable food products meant that it fared better than many businesses. People still needed to eat, and Heinz products represented good value. The company never laid off its entire workforce, though some reductions were necessary. Howard Heinz navigated the company through these difficult years with the same steady, cautious approach his father had employed during the Panic of 1873. He avoided risky expansion, maintained quality, and focused on core products. The company actually continued to be profitable throughout the Depression, though at reduced levels. Howard also maintained the family's tradition of treating workers well. While wages were reduced during the worst years, the company avoided the massive layoffs that many other firms implemented. The estate itself became somewhat of an anachronism during the Depression years. While millions of Americans struggled with poverty and hunger, the Heinz family continued to live in their mansion, with its 25 rooms and elaborate gardens. This disparity did not go unnoticed or unremarked upon. There were occasional critical articles in the press about wealthy families maintaining lavish lifestyles while others suffered. But Howard, following his father's example, was known for his charitable giving and his company's relatively humane treatment of workers, which tempered some of the criticism. Howard died in February of 1941 at the age of 63. His death came as World War II was already underway in Europe, though America had not yet entered the conflict. Howard had suffered from heart problems for several years, and his death, while relatively sudden, was not entirely unexpected. He was buried in the family plot at Homewood Cemetery, next to his parents. Leadership of the H.J. Heinz Company passed to Howard's son, Henry John Heinz II, who had been born in 1908 and was just 33 years old when he assumed control of the company. Known as Jack to distinguish him from his grandfather, the younger Henry Heinz was well prepared for his role, having worked in various positions throughout the company to learn the business. But he faced enormous challenges. World War II would transform American society and business, and the post-war period would bring changes that no one in the 19th century could have imagined. The estate remained in the family during World War II, though like many large properties, it was affected by the wartime conditions. Staff became difficult to retain as young people went into military service or took higher-paying jobs in war industries. Gasoline rationing made maintaining the extensive grounds more difficult. Some of the greenhouses fell into disrepair as labor and materials for maintenance became scarce. The mansion itself was maintained, but some of the more elaborate landscaping features were simplified out of necessity. The Heinz Company played an important role in the war effort, producing vast quantities of canned goods for military rations. The company's experience with large-scale food processing and canning made it a valuable supplier, and Heinz products were shipped all over the world to feed American troops. This war production was profitable and helped establish Heinz as a truly national company, as soldiers who had eaten Heinz products during the war remembered them afterward and sought them out as consumers. The post-war period brought unprecedented prosperity to America. The GI Bill enabled millions of veterans to attend college and buy homes. Suburbanization accelerated as highways were built and automobiles became universal. Television transformed media and advertising. Frozen foods and later microwave ovens changed how Americans ate. The H.J. Heinz Company adapted to these changes, introducing new products, building new facilities, and eventually expanding internationally to a degree that would have astounded the company's founder. But the estate itself was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. The costs of operating such a large property with full-time staff had always been substantial. But in the post-war economy, with higher wages and changing social expectations, these costs became almost prohibitive. The estate had been designed for a time when large households of servants were normal for wealthy families. By the 1950s, even very wealthy families rarely maintained such elaborate domestic establishments. The skills required to manage and maintain such a property, head gardeners who could manage greenhouse complexes, butlers who could oversee large staffs, specialized craftsmen for maintenance, were becoming increasingly difficult to find. Jack Heinz, the third generation of Heinz leadership, had a different relationship with the estate than his grandfather or father. He had grown up there, certainly, but he had also seen more of the world. He had attended college at Yale, had traveled extensively, and had broader horizons than the Pennsylvania-focused worldview of his grandfather. He maintained the estate during the 1940s and early 50s, but it was increasingly clear that the property was not practical as a private family residence in the modern age. The question of what to do with the estate became more pressing as the 1950s progressed. Simply abandoning it was unthinkable. It represented too much of the family's history and contained too many memories. Demolishing it would have been equally problematic, both emotionally and practically. The house was solidly built and could last for centuries if properly maintained. But continuing to operate it as a private residence was becoming financially untenable, even for a family as wealthy as the Heinzes. In 1955, Jack Heinz made a decision that would determine the estate's future. Rather than continuing to maintain it as a private family home, he donated the estate to the Pittsburgh History and Landmarks Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to preserving significant historic properties in the Pittsburgh area. The donation included not just the mansion, but also most of the grounds, the outbuildings, and a substantial endowment to help with maintenance costs. The terms of the donation specified that the property should be preserved and made accessible to the public as a museum and historic site. This donation was motivated by several factors. Certainly, it solved the practical problem of maintaining the property. But it was also consistent with the Heinz family's long tradition of philanthropy and civic engagement. Henry John Heinz had always believed in giving back to the community, and his descendants shared this commitment. By donating the estate as a historic property, Jack Heinz ensured that it would be preserved, and that the public would be able to see and appreciate this monument to the Gilded Age and to his grandfather's achievements. The transfer of the property from private to institutional ownership took several years to complete. The Pittsburgh History and Landmarks Foundation began the process of cataloging the contents of the mansion, which included an enormous amount of furniture, artwork, decorative objects, and personal items accumulated by 3 generations of Heinzes. Some items were kept as part of the house museum collection. Others were distributed to family members. Still others were sold at auction to help fund the property's maintenance. The foundation also faced the challenge of making the property safe and accessible for public visitors. While the house had been maintained, it needed updating to meet modern building codes, fire safety standards, and accessibility requirements. Electrical and plumbing systems needed upgrading. The greenhouses, which had deteriorated significantly during and after World War II, required extensive restoration work. The grounds needed to be reconfigured to accommodate parking and visitor facilities. The estate officially opened to the public as a historic house museum in 1959. Initial attendance was modest but steady, with most visitors being Pittsburgh area residents interested in local history or admirers of Victorian and Gilded Age architecture. Guided tours were offered several days a week, taking visitors through the main rooms of the mansion and explaining the history of the Heinz family and their business. The greenhouses were partially restored and also opened for tours, though on a more limited basis. Through the 1960s and 70s, the estate settled into its role as a historic site. It was never one of the major tourist attractions in Pittsburgh. The city had other, more prominent historic sites, and the estate's location in Sharpsburg was somewhat removed from the main tourist areas. But it maintained a steady presence as a cultural institution, hosting school groups, offering special programs on Victorian life and Gilded Age history, and serving as a venue for weddings and other private events that helped generate revenue for maintenance. The H.J. Heinz Company continued to grow and prosper through these decades, becoming increasingly divorced from its Pittsburgh roots. In 1966, the company went public, selling stock for the first time in its history. While the Heinz family retained a substantial ownership stake, they no longer had complete control. The company expanded internationally, acquiring foreign food companies and building new facilities around the world. By the 1970s, Heinz was a truly global corporation with operations on every continent except Antarctica. The connection between the company and the estate became increasingly tenuous. Company executives occasionally visited the estate for special events, and the company maintained a relationship with the Pittsburgh History and Landmarks Foundation. But the estate was no longer central to the company's identity, in the way it had been in Henry John Heinz's time. The company's headquarters remained in Pittsburgh, but in a modern office building downtown, not at the historic factory site in the Strip District. The 1980s and 90s brought new challenges for historic preservation in America. Many historic properties struggled to maintain themselves financially as government funding for cultural institutions declined and competition for donor dollars increased. The Heinz estate faced these same challenges. Attendance fluctuated. Maintenance costs continued to rise. The endowment provided by Jack Heinz in the 1950s, while generous, was no longer sufficient to cover all expenses, and the foundation had to fundraise actively to keep the property operating. During this period, the estate underwent several significant restoration projects. In the 1980s, the exterior of the mansion was restored, with damaged brickwork repaired and the slate roof replaced. In the 1990s, several of the main interior rooms were restored to their original 19th century appearance, using historic photographs and paint analysis to determine authentic color schemes and decorative treatments. These projects were expensive, but necessary to prevent further deterioration of the historic fabric of the building. The greenhouse complex posed particular challenges. These structures had deteriorated severely, and by the 1980s, only portions of the original complex remained. The iron framework was rusted, Many glass panes were broken, and the heating system was long defunct. A major restoration campaign in the late 1990s succeeded in stabilizing what remained and partially reconstructing some sections. But the greenhouses never returned to their former glory. The cost of fully restoring and maintaining Victorian-era greenhouses is simply prohibitive for most institutions, and the Heinz estate was no exception. As the estate entered the 21st century, it faced an uncertain future. The Pittsburgh History and Landmarks Foundation continued to operate it as a house museum and event venue, but with limited resources and competing priorities. The foundation was responsible for numerous historic properties throughout the Pittsburgh area, and the Heinz estate was just one of many demands on its attention and funds. Attendance at the estate remained modest, typically a few thousand visitors per year, which generated some revenue, but not enough to make the property self-sustaining. In 2013, a major milestone occurred when the H.J. Heinz Company, which had been headquartered in Pittsburgh for 144 years, was acquired by Berkshire Hathaway and 3G Capital for approximately $23 billion. The acquisition was later followed by a merger with Kraft Foods, creating the Kraft Heinz Company. While the Heinz brand remained and continues to be used on products worldwide, the company's connection to Pittsburgh weakened significantly. Corporate offices were moved out of Pittsburgh. The historic factory site in the Strip District was repurposed for other uses. The Heinz name remained on football stadium in Pittsburgh through a sponsorship deal, but the deep integration of the company into Pittsburgh's identity had largely dissolved. This corporate transformation had implications for the estate as well. While the Kraft Heinz Company maintained some philanthropic relationships in Pittsburgh, it no longer had the same sense of responsibility for preserving the founder's legacy. The company's corporate culture was focused on global operations and financial performance, not on maintaining historic properties connected to founders who had died nearly a century ago. The estate could no longer rely on corporate support from the Heinz Company as it once had. The estate today faces the same challenges that confront many historic house museums in 21st century America. The model of operating historic homes as museums supported by admission fees and donations is increasingly difficult to sustain. Most Americans have little connection to or understanding of the Gilded Age. The lifestyle represented by the estate, wealthy industrialist families living in enormous mansions tended by staffs of servants, seems remote and even problematic to contemporary sensibilities. Younger generations are less interested in traditional house museums and more drawn to interactive, technology-based cultural experiences. The Pittsburgh History and Landmarks Foundation has worked to make the estate more relevant and accessible to contemporary visitors. Special programs have been developed focusing on themes like immigration and the American dream, using Henry John Heinz's story as an immigrant son who achieved enormous success through hard work and innovation. Educational programs for school groups emphasize business history, Victorian social customs, and Gilded Age architecture. The estate's event business has been expanded, hosting more weddings, corporate functions, and private parties, which generate needed revenue, though they also create wear and tear on the historic property. The physical condition of the estate remains reasonably good due to ongoing maintenance, though deferred maintenance issues are always present. The mansion's roof, though replaced in the 1980s, will need attention again within the next decade. The foundation plantings, many of which date to the original landscaping, are reaching the end of their lifespans and will need to be replaced. The mechanical systems, updated over the years, require constant attention. The greenhouse complex continues to deteriorate, with no realistic prospect for full restoration given the enormous costs involved. One of the interesting aspects of the estate's current situation is how it serves as a document of changing American attitudes toward wealth and preservation. When Henry John Heinz built the estate in the 1890s, it was a symbol of success and achievement, something to be admired and emulated. When it became a museum in the 1950s, it was viewed nostalgically as a reminder of a grander era. Today, visitors often have more complicated reactions: admiration for the craftsmanship and beauty, but also discomfort with the enormous disparity of wealth it represents, and questions about the social costs of industrial fortunes like the one that built the estate. The estate also raises questions about preservation priorities and resources. America has thousands of historic buildings and sites, all competing for limited preservation funding and public attention. Why should resources be devoted to preserving the mansion of a wealthy industrialist when other, perhaps more significant sites need attention? The answer typically given is that the estate represents important aspects of American history: immigration, industrialization, the rise of branded consumer products, Gilded Age architecture, Victorian domestic life. But these are abstract justifications, and they don't always resonate with potential donors or visitors. From an architectural standpoint, the estate remains significant. It is an excellent and relatively unaltered example of Gilded Age residential architecture, showing the eclectic style that was popular among wealthy Americans in the late 19th century. The quality of construction and finishes is exceptional, demonstrating the level of craftsmanship that was possible when money was no object and skilled artisans were available. Architecture students and scholars of Victorian design continue to study the house as an important example of its type and period. The estate's grounds, though reduced from their original extent and no longer maintained to 19th century standards, still provide a sense of what such properties were like. The surviving trees, many of them over a century old, give a sense of scale and age. The remnants of the formal gardens and the layout of pathways show how the landscape was designed to provide both beauty and privacy. Even in their reduced state, the greenhouse structures hint at the elaborate horticultural operations that once existed here. One of the most valuable aspects of the estate for historians is its documentary record. The Heinz family kept extensive records, photographs, and correspondence, much of which is now housed in archives accessible to researchers. These documents provide insights not just into the family, but into Gilded Age business practices, Victorian social customs, and the daily operations of a large household. Scholars studying this period regularly use materials related to the estate in their research, even if they never visit the physical property. The estate has also served as a filming location for various movie and television productions set in the late 19th or early 20th centuries. The relatively unaltered historic character of the mansion and its setting make it attractive for period productions. These film shoots provide some additional revenue for the property and help raise awareness of its existence, though they also create logistical challenges and potential risks to the historic fabric. As of 2026, the estate continues to operate under the stewardship of the Pittsburgh History and Landmarks Foundation, though its long-term future remains uncertain. The foundation has explored various possibilities for the property's evolution. One proposal would transform part of the estate into a conference center or boutique hotel, providing more stable revenue while preserving the historic character of the main house. Another idea would focus more heavily on educational programming, partnering with local universities to use the estate as a teaching site for courses in history, architecture, business, and related fields. There have also been discussions about finding a new use for the greenhouse complex, perhaps partnering with a horticultural organization or university program that could restore and use the structures for actual plant cultivation, rather than leaving them as empty monuments to past glory. Such a partnership could honor John Heinz's passion for horticulture, while giving the greenhouses a practical purpose that would justify the enormous expense of their restoration. The fundamental challenge remains unchanged from what it has been for decades: how to maintain a large, expensive historic property in a way that is both financially sustainable and true to the property's historic character and significance. This is not a problem unique to the Heinz estate. Historic house museums across America face similar challenges. Some have found creative solutions through adaptive reuse, special programming, or endowment building. Others have been forced to close, sell, or transfer to new owners. The trajectory of the Heinz estate will likely be determined by the creativity and determination of its stewards, and by the level of community support it can maintain. One factor working in the estate's favor is Pittsburgh's ongoing renaissance as a city. After decades of decline following the collapse of the steel industry, Pittsburgh has reinvented itself as a center for healthcare, education, and technology. The city's population has stabilized, and certain neighborhoods have become quite desirable. Cultural institutions in Pittsburgh have generally fared well during this renaissance, with increased attendance and support. This positive trajectory for the city as a whole provides a more favorable context for the estate's continued operation than would have been the case 30 or 40 years ago, when Pittsburgh's future seemed much bleaker. The estate also benefits from being connected to a brand name that remains universally recognized. Even though the H.J. Heinz Company is no longer based in Pittsburgh and is now part of a much larger corporation, the Heinz name remains familiar to virtually every American. This name recognition helps attract visitors who might not otherwise be interested in visiting a historic house museum. The connection to the famous ketchup and other Heinz products provides an accessible entry point for understanding the estate's significance. The surviving descendants of Henry John Heinz, now in their fifth and sixth generations, maintain varying levels of interest in and connection to the estate. Some family members remain actively involved in Pittsburgh philanthropy and support the estate. Others have little connection to Pittsburgh, having been born and raised elsewhere. The Heinz Family Foundation continues to exist and supports various charitable causes, though its resources are spread across many organizations, and the estate is just one of many potential recipients of support. Looking at the estate today, it stands as a monument to a particular moment in American history. The Gilded Age, when industrial fortunes were being made, when immigrant families could rise to extraordinary wealth and prominence, when technology and capitalism were transforming American society in fundamental ways. The house itself, with its solid brick walls and intricate woodwork, its fireplaces and chandeliers, its servants' quarters and its conservatory, tells the story of how wealthy Americans lived in that era. It shows what they valued, how they spent their money, what gave them pleasure and status. But the estate also tells a more recent story, of how we preserve and interpret our history, of changing attitudes toward wealth and industry, of the challenges of maintaining historic properties in contemporary America. The fact that this house exists at all, that it hasn't been demolished or subdivided or destroyed, is itself historically significant. It exists because 3 generations of the Heinz family chose to maintain it, because Jack Heinz had the foresight and civic commitment to donate it for preservation, and because the Pittsburgh History and Landmarks Foundation and its supporters have worked for over 60 years to keep it viable. The estate represents layers of history: the original vision and construction in the 1890s, the family life that filled it for 6 decades, its transformation into a public institution, its ongoing evolution as needs and resources change. Each layer adds to the complexity and richness of the site's historical significance. The house is not a static artifact but a living document that continues to accumulate meaning as time passes, and as it interacts with successive generations of visitors and stewards. Standing on the grounds of the Heinz estate today, looking at the mansion with its Romanesque arches and its complex roofline, walking through gardens that echo but don't exactly replicate the original design, peering into the skeletal remains of the greenhouse complex, one can sense both the grandeur of what was and the difficulty of maintaining such grandeur across time. The estate is simultaneously impressive and somewhat melancholy. Impressive for what it represents in terms of craftsmanship, ambition, and historical significance. Melancholy because it exists in a world that has moved past the assumptions and conditions that created it. The question of what will happen to the Heinz estate over the next 20, 50, or 100 years remains open. Will it continue as a house museum, gradually deteriorating despite best efforts at maintenance? Will it find some new adaptive use that provides financial sustainability while preserving its historic character? Will it eventually be partially or fully dismantled as maintenance costs become truly prohibitive? Will some combination of public support, creative programming, and endowment building allow it to thrive as a valued cultural institution? These questions don't have clear answers, but they are questions worth contemplating, because they apply not just to this one estate, but to thousands of historic properties across America. We as a society must continually decide what aspects of our past are worth preserving, what resources we are willing to devote to preservation, and how we can make historic sites relevant and meaningful to contemporary and future generations. The Heinz estate stands as both a specific case study and a symbol of these larger questions about heritage, memory, and stewardship. The story of the Heinz family and their estate is ultimately a deeply American story. It's about immigration and opportunity, about entrepreneurship and innovation, about the creation of vast wealth through industrial capitalism, about family legacy and generational change, about the attempt to create something permanent in a country and culture that is always rushing toward the future. Henry John Heinz came from humble origins and built an empire, then built a mansion to embody and celebrate that achievement. His descendants inherited and maintained that mansion, adapting it to changing times, until finally deciding that its greatest value was as a public educational resource rather than a private residence. In many ways, the estate represents the American dream, not just in Henry's original success, but in the family's eventual decision to share this piece of their history with the broader public. Rather than clinging to the property as a symbol of private wealth and status, the Heinz family chose to make it accessible, to let it tell its story to anyone willing to visit and listen. That choice reflects values of democratic access to culture and history that are as fundamentally American as the entrepreneurial drive that built the fortune in the first place. The physical house itself, its solidity, its craftsmanship, its attention to detail, speaks to values that we sometimes associate with an earlier era: permanence, quality, pride, and work well done. The house was built to last for centuries, and it has indeed lasted now for more than 130 years. It was built by craftsmen who knew their trades deeply and took pride in their work, even when that work would be largely invisible to anyone but other craftsmen. The foundation is massive, the walls are thick, the timber is solid, the joints are tight. This level of construction quality is rare in any era, and almost unheard of in contemporary building. Yet for all its solidity, the estate has always been vulnerable to the forces of time and change. No amount of solid construction can overcome neglect or lack of resources for maintenance. Historic buildings require constant care, roofs need replacing, wood needs painting, systems need updating, grounds need tending. Without this ongoing care, even the most solidly built structure will eventually succumb to entropy. The estate has survived as well as it has because people have cared enough to maintain it, to invest resources in its preservation, to ensure that it doesn't simply fade away. The greenhouse complex provides a stark illustration of what happens when maintenance lapses. These structures, which were Henry's pride and joy, which once housed exotic plants from around the world, which represented cutting-edge horticultural technology of their time, have been reduced to fragmentary ruins because the cost and expertise required to maintain them properly were not available during certain periods. Victorian greenhouses are particularly vulnerable. Their iron frameworks rust, their glass breaks, their elaborate heating and ventilation systems fail. Once deterioration begins, it accelerates rapidly unless arrested by major intervention. The estate's art collection, furniture, and decorative objects also tell stories about changing tastes and values. Much of what seemed important and beautiful to the Heinzes, elaborate Victorian furniture, sentimental paintings, ornate decorative objects, fell out of favor in later eras. Modernism rejected the Victorian aesthetic as cluttered and overwrought. Many items that were expensive and prized when new became unfashionable, and nearly worthless by the mid-20th century. Only more recently has there been renewed appreciation for Victorian design and craftsmanship, but even so, the market for such items is limited and specialized. This cycle of fashion and taste complicates preservation efforts. Should a historic house be maintained exactly as it was during its period of greatest significance? Or should later alterations and additions be preserved as part of the property's continuing history? Should missing items be replaced with period-appropriate substitutes? Or should gaps be left to acknowledge honestly what has been lost? These are questions that every historic property must grapple with, and different institutions answer them differently based on their resources, priorities, and philosophies. The Heinz estate has generally been maintained with an emphasis on its original late 19th century configuration, though some early 20th century additions like the chapel have been preserved as well. This approach treats the property primarily as a document of the Gilded Age, with later periods acknowledged but not emphasized. This makes sense given that the estate's primary significance is as an example of Gilded Age wealth and lifestyle, but it does mean that some aspects of the property's history are less visible than others. The relationship between the estate and the surrounding neighborhood of Sharpsburg adds another dimension to the story. When Henry built his mansion, the area was relatively rural, and the estate enjoyed a sense of isolation and privacy. Over the decades, the neighborhood filled in with more modest homes, and Sharpsburg became a working-class community. Today, the estate sits somewhat incongruously in a neighborhood of small houses and narrow lots, a vestige of a different era and a different economic reality. This juxtaposition raises interesting questions about class, history, and community identity. Some Sharpsburg residents take pride in having this historic landmark in their community, seeing it as a source of distinction and cultural value. Others have more ambivalent feelings, seeing the mansion as a symbol of inequality and a reminder that the fruits of industrial capitalism were not evenly distributed. These different perspectives are all valid responses to the complex history that the estate represents. The house doesn't tell a simple story of progress or decline, but rather a multifaceted narrative about American development, with winners and losers, with genuine achievements and significant costs. The estate also serves as a reminder of the environmental costs of industrialization. The Pittsburgh region paid a heavy price for its industrial prosperity, with air and water pollution that made the city notorious by the mid-20th century. Henry's desire to build his estate outside the city, in a location with cleaner air, was itself a response to the pollution created by industries like his own. The irony that he escaped to the countryside, while his workers remained in the polluted city, was not lost on critics of the era. Today, with Pittsburgh's air and water significantly cleaner thanks to environmental regulations and the decline of heavy industry, this particular disparity has diminished, but the historical record remains. As we consider the estate's future, it's worth remembering that historic preservation itself reflects certain values and priorities. We preserve buildings and sites that we believe tell important stories, that embody significant aspects of our history, that represent achievements worth remembering and studying. But deciding which stories are important, which aspects of history are significant, which achievements are worth commemorating, these are subjective judgments that change over time and reflect the values of those making the decisions. The decision to preserve the Heinz estate reflects a judgment that Gilded Age industrial history matters, that immigrant success stories are worth celebrating, that the architecture and domestic life of wealthy Americans in the late 19th century are subjects worthy of study and preservation. These judgments can be questioned. One could argue that the homes of ordinary working people, or of immigrant communities, or of groups traditionally excluded from wealth and power, would be more valuable to preserve. The challenge, of course, is that modest homes were built less substantially, and have been less likely to survive, and that preservation requires resources that are rarely available for properties without powerful advocates. The Heinz estate has survived in part because it was built extremely well, because the family maintained it carefully, because it was gifted to an organization capable of continuing that maintenance, and because the Heinz name carries weight and recognition that helps attract support. Many other properties of equal or greater historical significance have been lost because they lacked one or more of these advantages. Historic preservation is not a neutral, objective process but one deeply influenced by economics, politics, and social power. And yet, even acknowledging these complexities, the estate remains a remarkable survival. It offers a tangible connection to a particular moment in American history. It allows visitors to experience, however imperfectly, something of how people lived in that era. It preserves craftsmanship and design approaches that are no longer practiced. It serves as a teaching tool for understanding industrialization, immigration, wealth accumulation, and social change. These are valuable functions, even if the estate also represents aspects of history that are uncomfortable or controversial. The story of the Heinz family estate is, in the end, a story about ambition and achievement, about family and legacy, about the passage of time and the difficulty of preserving the past. It's about one man's desire to create something lasting and beautiful, and about his descendants' struggles to maintain what he created. It's about changing American values and priorities, about the tension between private wealth and public good, about the challenge of making history accessible and meaningful to contemporary audiences. It's a story that continues to unfold, with each new chapter adding complexity and raising new questions about stewardship, memory, and historical significance. Thank you for joining us on this deep exploration of the Heinz family estate. Here at the Dark Estate, we're committed to bringing you these thoroughly researched, authentic historical narratives about America's most fascinating mansions and the families who built them. If you found this journey through history compelling, please subscribe to our channel so you never miss an episode. Hit that like button to help others discover these incredible true stories. And please leave a comment below telling us which historic estate you'd like us to investigate next. Your suggestions guide our research and help us bring you the content you're most interested in. Until next time, we'll continue uncovering the real stories behind America's grand estates.